So welcome back to our audience, and this is the second in a series with Dr. Stuart Reece, who is an expert in cannabis epidemiology. And so over to you, Stuart.
Thanks, Gary. Yeah, well, today we'd like to talk about cannabis and limb development, because this is an important class of congenital anomalies, of birth defects, and it's highly topical because, of course, the international drug regulation paradigm actually stems from the thalidomide disaster of about 1958, 1959, and the disasters there. So it was limb anomalies, which was formative in the international drug regulatory regime right around the world, and it was because of the effect of thalidomide on limb development in particular. So we'll talk a bit more about that later. So we're going to talk about limbs in America, Europe, thalidomide, and food chain contamination today. And this is all in our book, which will be out in the next few weeks from Elsevier, Epidemiology of Cannabis, which talks about the epidemiology, the patterns of disease, and also the causes of disease as it's been published. And we're going to talk about that a bit today.
Can I just go back to that slide? The book was due out in March, and yet you think it is coming fairly soon. It has been held up pre-publication.
Yeah, that's right, Gary. That's right, yeah. Now, this is a picture of phocomelia or flipper limbs. See, the upper and lower parts of the arm are missing, and the hand attaches directly to the shoulder and the legs. Similarly, these are internet pictures. And this is a picture of a normal limb development. And this is the limb bud starting to form. And you can see that there's a gradient between fibroblast growth factor and the Wntz and retinoic acid here. And that gradient determines limb development to a large extent. And it's these contrasting gradients that determine where the limb forms and how it forms. And you can see that this is the same in this limb that's forming here. It's the same overall pattern.
So you're saying that we know the mechanisms pretty well for limb development?
Yeah, that's right. It's these are known as morphogens, and it's these contrasting gradients which control all the details of limb development. And these are some of the major morphogens, and these are some of the major genes involved, HOXA genes and the mice genes. And this is how the limb forms, and there's a progress zone, early specification, 2 signal gradients, fibroblast growth factor and retinoic acid, as we've said, which control all the stages of limb development. And these are some of the key genes, and these are some of the different parts of limb development. And this is the same thing in more detail, and this is different kinds of foot or hoof or limb for these different animals, as you can see. And this is a sonic hedgehog, is a major morphogen. And these are some of the key genes. Bone morphogenetic proteins, another major morphogen. GREM's a major morphogen. And these others here are genes which act under the influence of these morphogens, which control the weaving together of the limb and the paw or the hoof or whichever. And these things, differently expressed in different species, control the different ways that the limb is formed, the details. So you'll notice these genes. And now this is called an epigenome-wide association study. These are some results. And see here on the left is some of these genes we've talked about, mice 1 and 2, some of the fibroblast growth factors, 4. This is the retinoic acid, the retinoids, and this is the Wntz. And if you come over here in this column, you see that there is 37 hits on mice 1, 97 hits in the epigenome-wide study. That's called an EWAS. And here is the reference for that. 175 for the fibroblast growth factors, 7 for FGF4, and some here, 203 for the Wntz. And so it just goes on. Chromodomain, there's a lot of hits here in each of these columns. And you can see that what this means is that the genes that control limb development are broadly deranged at the software level, at the epigenetic level by prenatal cannabinoid exposure. That's what this is showing.
Okay, so this is not your study. This is somebody else's study that you're actually putting up on the screen, and there is a good level of certainty.
Yeah. This is the p-value here. In science, p less than 0.05 is significant. When you come to genome-wide association studies, GWASs and EWASs, you have to correct for the number of genes that you're testing. It's called multiplicity correction. But even so, the p-values are very high. Here's 10 to the minus 43, even for an epigenome-wide association study. And this is the reference here from the North Carolina group, the world-leading group in the epigenome genomics of cannabinoids.
Okay.
So let's look at America, and this is taken from our paper, which this is a spatial epidemiology journal, spatial and spatiotemporal epidemiology. This is what's happened in the US. And this is the phocomelia rates across the US over time, assuming a 0.63 non-live birth rate.
Now just explain that phocomelia for us, please, Stuart.
Well, phocomelia is the flipper limb we saw in the opening slides, where the hands attaches directly to the shoulder.
Okay.
Now, the non-live birth rate, a lot of these babies, these fetuses, are aborted therapeutically because parents don't wish to have a baby with a severe deformity. So that's known as early termination of pregnancy for anomaly, ETOPFA. And the international rate in the big international series is 0.63. So assuming that that's what's been happening in America, you can see there's a clear rise with time trend, which is highly significant. And if we look at the quintiles of cannabinoid exposure, this is 1, 2, 3, 4 in the fifth quintile. You see there's a big jump up to the fifth quintile, which is highly significant, much less than 0.05.
Okay, so what does a quintile tell us, Stuart? What's the meaning of a quintile?
A quintile divides the cannabis exposure in the exposed population into 5 groups. That's why it's called quintile. And so the highest quintile of cannabinoid exposure has a much higher rate of phocomelia, with a certainty level of 4 by 10 to the minus 6, which is a high degree of certainty for a big jump from the 4th to the 5th quintile. Okay. And when you compare the highest quintile, the 5th quintile, with the others, it's even more significant, 2 by 10 to the minus 8. So these are highly significant results. And this is the same sort of thing over time. There's quintile 5 at the top, and the other quintiles are less. So you get the same result over time. Now, this is drug exposure plots for ETOP rates of 0.37 and 0.63%. 0.37 is said to be the approximate rate of ETOPFA in the US, and 0.63 is the international ETOPFA.
Just remind the audience of ETOPFA, what that actually stands for.
It's early termination of pregnancy for the anomaly. So that's where the fetuses are aborted and they don't come to live birth.
That's it.
Now this is the variables from the National Survey of Drug Use and Health conducted by SAMHSA and in the US Department of Health and Human Services, looking at the rates of, this is the drug exposure here, and this is the rate of phocomelia as a function of the drug exposure. And if there's a strong relationship, you'd expect to see an upward sloping line. This is with no correction for ETOPFA in this column here. And you see most of these lines are pretty flat. Some of them go down. The one for analgesics goes up a little bit. And the one for cannabis is slightly upwards there, as you can see. But as the ETOPFA rate rises, 0.37 there and 0.63 here, you can see the slope of this cannabis curve rises significantly in association with increased drug exposure.
Okay, and you're measuring that against a whole lot of other different drug types. Is that
that's right? Correct? That's right. So this is cannabis, that's cocaine, that's binge alcohol, that's cigarettes, that's analgesics, abuse or dependence on illicit drugs there. That's abuse or dependent on alcohol, and that's abuse or dependent on illicit drugs or alcohol there. So there's all these other addictions here, other measures of addictive drug use, and most of them fairly nondescript. But the standout here, particularly as the ETO-PFA rate rises, is clearly cannabis. That's what this shows. This is the cannabis panel down there. Now, this is looking at the different cannabinoids, again, at the three different rates of ETO-PFA exposure. This is cannabis use monthly, first trimester cannabis exposure, daily cannabis use, delta THC, delta 9 THC, cannabidiol, cannabichromine, cannabinol, and cannabigerol. And you can see that as the ETO-PFA rate rises, so the slopes of these cannabinoid regression lines also rises.
Okay, so going back to the particular cannabinoids that we're looking at, cannabidiol, many people know of that as CBD, cannabigerol, I think that's how you're pronouncing it. These are all constituents within cannabis, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And this shows that at least at the association level, at the statistical epidemiological level, there's a close relationship with multiple cannabinoids, not just THC. And see, the end of this curve is higher than the start of that. The end of this line and its confidence interval is higher than the start. That's indicative of a statistically significant difference across that range.
Yeah.
So that's actually showing statistically significant associations.
Mm.
Now, this is a phocomelia rate over space and time across the US. And you can see there's a very high rate here in Oregon and Alaska, and less so in some of these other states. So it shows, and Alaska actually has had legal or decriminalized cannabis for several decades. So that fits.
I can say this about Oregon and Alaska is they went, Oregon particularly, I think it was 1973, or it could have been 75, they actually decriminalized cannabis. And I think they were the first in the US to decriminalize. And then Alaska, as I understand it, was the first to legalize. And they kind of rolled that back, maybe 1992, somewhere back there. They have since re-legalized, legalized it again after all those years. Anyway, keep going.
So that's the map across space and time right there. Now, this is a spatial regression for the ETO-PFA correction at 0.63. And you'll see that even adjusting for THC exposure, cannabigerol exposure, and all this ethnic THC exposure here, and here it's lagged by 2 years, here lagged by 4 years, that parameters with cannabis in are still significant after adjustment for all these other factors. You've got income, you've got all the drugs, income, races, ethnicity, and even after adjustment for all that other stuff, in the final models, cannabis is still highly significant.
So it persists no matter what?
Yeah, it's cannabis regardless. Now, E values or expected values, this has come out from UCLA and also the T.H. Chan School of Public Health at Harvard. E values predict the likelihood that an association could be due to unmeasured confounding. And the more than 1.25 is thought to be causal. And all of these E values here, most of them are more than 1.25. And this is the lower confidence interval, 95% confidence interval. Many of those are more than 1.25. And some of them are very high, as you can see, 10 to the 131. And this is 1500 there. That one's infinite. So some of these E values in this paper are extremely high, which is consistent with a causal relationship. If we look at the effect of cannabis legalization across the US, it's a little confusing. Of course, it changed over time. But if you compare the legal cannabis with all the others, you find that the legal rate is much higher, as you can see there, with a highly significant p-value of 0.0071. And this is just showing with the different ETO-PFA rates there that the p-values increase as the ETO-PFA rate rises. But even without adjustment, it's still significant. Now, if we look at Europe, what happened in Europe, and this is the reference for that, this is published there. Now, this is a panel plot. This is looking at the cocaine use, amphetamine use, resin THC content, annual alcohol use, and tobacco. And these various limb anomalies as a function of rising exposure to the different drugs. So you've got clubfoot, hip dysplasia, limb anomalies, limb reductions, polydactyly, which is extra fingers and toes, and syndactyly, which is where the toes and fingers are joined together.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see for some of them, the lines go down. For most of them, the line's fairly flat. But for the cannabis here in the middle, the THC resin, some of these lines are strongly in the upward direction. The European data is already adjusted for ETO-PFA.
Okay.
Now here so that's the drugs. Then we come to cannabinoid metrics. We've got different metrics of cannabinoids. So we've got the same 6 birth defects across there. We've got last month cannabis, herb, the cannabis herb consumption, resin consumption, daily cannabis interpolated, because there's some missing data. Last month cannabis times herb, last month cannabis times the resin THC concentration, and then the last month cannabis times the herb times the daily use interpolated, last month cannabis times the resin THC times the daily use interpolated. So we've got all these different metrics of cannabis, and you can see that in a lot of these different birth defects, the regression lines are sloping strongly upwards. There's really no question of that. And that contrasts to this table where we looked at tobacco, alcohol, amphetamine, and most of the cocaines where there was little relationship. For some of these cocaine ones, there was a positive slope. But so that's a very different picture with the different indices of cannabis exposure. Now, if we look at limb rates across the US over time, we find that in France they've been relatively high, as you can see here from the bar graph. That's Netherlands, that's pretty high. Bulgaria's pretty high. Norway's pretty high, although it's dropped there. So that's really the pattern that we're seeing there. And then limb reduction disorder, this is where the limbs are shorter. Netherlands is high, Bulgaria is very high. Germany was high there, but has dropped somewhat. And that's the main patterns that we see. France was high, it's down a little. And then if we compare, this is the cannabis over time in Europe. So it's high in the Iberian Peninsula. This is Spain, that's France. And that's the pattern of what's going on there. This is that's cannabis herb, THC concentration. This is cannabis resin. And you can see the same pattern there. And then if we chart these two together, this is a bivariate chloropleth map. And what this shows, the pink and purple is where both the anomaly and the cannabis are high, and the green is where they're both low. So this is showing 2 variables on one map. And you can see here Netherlands, Germany and France and Bulgaria are purple and pink there. Norway is, as you can see there. So that's the standout messages from that graph. This is limb disorder rate, and this is the limb reduction rate. Again, Norway starts purple. France is purple, pink there. Netherlands, Bulgaria, and that's the pattern that you see across Europe.
So high correlations between cannabis use and...
Well, it's not just high correlations, it's high correlations in space and time.
Yes.
They're moving together in space and time. So it's not just a correlation.
Mm.
This is a very important space-time relationship, which we're demonstrating. Now, this is the same thing with polydactyly. This is extra fingers and toes. Sweden's purple in those shots. Norway, purple there. France, bright pink. Germany, Netherlands is featuring there. Bulgaria's purple there, as you can see. Now, this is cannabis bivariate category comparisons. And this is the different metrics. And this is the p-value. See, 10 to minus 292. And this is the e-value here, as you can see there. So limb defects geospatial models. So cannabis herb, resin, and daily interpolation. P-values are very low there, as you can see. And the herb is positive. This is an additive model, interactive model. And 2 years lag, because it takes a couple of years for this to come out in the birth population. And this is the e-values from all the geospatial models. And you can see that the e-values, some of these e-values are very high. And this is the lower bound, 95 bound, lower bound is also more than 1.25.
So that's causality kind of criteria again. And if they're very high, very strong causal inference.
That's right. So this table lists the 57 E values that emerged from this study. And you can see that 86% of them were more than, were higher than 9. And which is very high. That's the tobacco lung cancer relationship's got an E value of 9. And then this is above the limit of causality, 1.25, 57, 100% are above that limit, and 56, 98% of the lower E values are above that limit. So that's very strong evidence. And then this is anomaly by summary. So this is the median E values for these. The median E value estimate and the lower bounds are highly significant there. Now, I wanted to speak specifically about these newspaper reports that released. This site is available on the web. As you can see, the web address is there. On the 22nd of October 2018, and they mentioned here 14 babies were born in Ain and also in Brittany in the Normandy area, which put the rate of these birth defects 60 times above the background rate of what they were normally in France. And this was a great mystery, and the French Health Department conducted an inquiry. And it was thought that something in the food, water, air, or pesticides might be responsible. And it turns out that some of these women were living on a commune. So that may be a clue. There's the URL there. And these are the parts of France that were affected. The Normandy area, Brittany, and in the west, and Ain in the east on the Swiss border. And this is the epidemiologist who drew attention to this. So they were living in cereal growing areas, growing corn and sunflowers. And this is the nationwide inquiry that was follows 11 more suspected cases of birth, cutting the limbs at the time the embryo is developing. We must search for what this is. So she was thinking that something was interfering with birth development. Now, just a few days prior to that report on the 22nd of October, on the 18th of October, it was mentioned that in Ain, there was a media report, 135 kilos of cannabis resin, which is very concentrated, was found. And the gendarmerie, the police of France, was speaking of a vast drug trafficking ring. So there's presumably a high-level cannabis exposure going on, at least in Ain. This is the same week as the other one. And then this mayor wants to grow and sell cannabis in French fields. This is in the southwest of France. This is not in these areas we're talking about. This is another area where they were wanting to grow cannabis. Now, if you fast forward to 2023, you can actually find recommendations on the internet at this URL of where to grow which strains of cannabis in France. So cannabis use in France, it's well known, is becoming more common, as we saw in those maps earlier. And you can actually find instructions on how to grow. Now, this is a few years after the 2018 things that we talked about, but clearly it was a factor then. And then across the border in Germany, this is September 16, 2019, there were some reports at this hospital. There were three reports, and they went looking and they found another 30 cases. But Germany has no registry for birth defects or miscarriages, making it difficult for authorities to establish any wider pattern or see if it's becoming more common or rarer. So it's hard to track these in Germany because there's no national registry for these sort of things. But it's extraordinary. They had a midwife blew the whistle. She had 3 cases and another 30 turned up. And we know that cannabis use is becoming more common in Germany, who legalized medical cannabis on the 1st of April last year. So Germany has no birth defect registry to track such disasters. So let's talk about thalidomide. As we said at the beginning, that's where the modern drug regulation system came from. Thalidomide was one of the most commonly prescribed drugs in the world, second only to aspirin. And I want to give a shout out to this very informative, very detailed video that's online at this URL. about thalidomide, and you can see there's all this folk Amelia cases here. This very bright young lady has compiled endless details about the story. You can see all these kids. This is obviously an old photo, dancing around. Now, this is Dr. Francis Kelsey, who thalidomide never went to the US because Dr. Kelsey, who was the public servant working at the FDA at the time, found that the section of the file on teragenesis was blank and deficient, so she refused to pass it. So she saved America from the thalidomide holocaust. But in Europe, in Britain, in Australia, it was common. And this is a picture of Dr. William McBride from Crown Street Women's Hospital, which was the largest obstetric hospital in the Southern Hemisphere at the time, and Sister Pat Sparrow, who alerted Dr. McBride to what was going on. And then he travelled overseas and was a key advocate internationally for this process. Now, if you look at the pattern of birth defects from thalidomide and the pattern with cannabis, these are the published birth defects. Obviously, there's limb anomalies, but there's others as well. And what you find is that 21 of those 31 anomalies are also shared with cannabis. So there's a common overlap in the clinical syndromology and teratology of the two agents. And if you dig into literature and explore the mechanisms by which thalidomide works, of the 13 described mechanisms for thalidomide, cannabis shares 12. So there's marked teratological overlap, phenomenological overlap, and the mechanisms are closely shared between the two. And what's important here, this is the effect of cannabis to generate micronuclei and dividing red cells. You see there's a sudden jump at that point of exposure, and you see the same thing with thalidomide, genotoxic. You reach a threshold, and then the effect goes very vertical. It's almost asymptotic or exponential beyond a threshold effect, and we see that a lot of times when cannabinoids are studied in the laboratory. So let's talk about the food chain contamination. This is a very famous tetra-amelic patient, or individual at least, who now lives in California. He was born in Melbourne to conservative families who didn't use drugs, and there was no family history of amelia in his family, which tends to suggest a possible environmental intoxicant. Now, this is one of the structure of the breakdown products of cannabis, because cannabis gets into the wastewater through the sewage system and is processed and exposed to the sunlight. And you get these highly reactive metabolites formed, which have this COOH group, which are more reactive than cannabis and more genotoxic than cannabis just through environmental exposure. And that's what this is all about. And of course, it gets into the water, it gets into the grapes here, it gets into the swimming pools and into the fish. So it gets into the food chain, it's in the water.
Okay, so just go back on that last slide, Stuart. You're saying that cannabis is grown for recreational use, illegal use, or legal medical use. What are we talking about?
Yeah, it's just grown, but one way or another, it gets into the food chain. I mean, part of it in the cities, they do wastewater analysis, and they can see cannabis in the wastewater analysis that's going out through the sewage system, because many people in the cities use cannabis, so it can enter the food chain via humans.
Okay.
And this is the comment that the photooxidation of THC and its breakdown products and the other cannabinoids potentially more toxic than regulated disinfection byproducts. And the potential indirect exposure to cannabinoids and their metabolites through recreational water is of great interest and great concern. Based on the estrogenicity and cytotoxicity studies and modelling, it has been predicted that THC and THC-COOH pose moderate risk for adverse impact on the environment. So chlorination and photooxidation, so you get hyperoxides of the THC breakdown, but you get chlorination of the photooxidant breakdown products, and they're also very highly reactive. So that's where the concern comes from, that actual processing in some respects can make this worse. And then this is looking at the THC content. I think in some of the waterways in Canada, this is THC load per capita by month. In some of the Canadian waterways, you can see they go up pretty high, and this is in some of the different provinces of Canada. They actually measure it, so they're measuring this stuff in the waterways of Canada. And this is a very interesting and very concerning study done in cows, where they fed cows hemp, industrial hemp, which is in the US is supposed to be less than 0.2% THC. But they got the red eyes and the salivation and the saliva pool down here, and the tongue just playing inside the mouth, and mucus in the nose. These are all signs of cannabis intoxication. And of course, their milk dropped as well. So the cows were stoned from eating industrial hemp, which is said to be less than, below the threshold for THC. And this was shown that by drinking the milk, in many cases, infants and toddlers could be exposed above the safe levels, what is said to be safe levels of THC through the environment. That's what that shows. Now, the other thing about cannabis farms is they have rodenticides in them. They don't want the deer to come and eat the crop, so they use rodenticides. And you can see here, this is a dead bighorn sheep and a rabbit, and that's a badger, and that's a fox, that are dead due to eating either the rodents or the rabbits or the rats that eat the rodenticides, and then these other animals casualties. Here, there's a very dramatic video you can watch online where this family of bears, 2 adults and I think 1 or 2 cubs, walk into this cannabis grow site. This is a camp, and 5 minutes later, they're dead. There's the carcass right there. It's very dramatic. This is carbofuran, which is a highly toxic agent and has actually been banned. So as well as the toxicity from the cannabinoids, you've got environmental toxicant. Now, safe as houses, we all know the expression safe as houses. There's actually in Melbourne, there's a hemp building company, and they talk about that their product is non-toxic. It's called hempcrete, which is something like concrete, hemp fiber mixed with limestone, and they can make walls and tables from it. And it's said to be non-toxic, but I don't think they understand about cannabinoid genotoxicity. So what we're talking about here, when the cannabinoids and contaminate the water table and the food chain, given the genotoxicity, we actually have an inversion of the usual terms of the drug debate. In the drug debate, the debate is shifted from my right to use drugs to removal of your right not to use drugs or even be told. Poisoning a population removes informed consent, which is really what you're talking about. And there are other aspects to this that we haven't talked about. Cannabis can grow mold or viruses or bacteria. It can concentrate heavy metals and toxic metals. There's other things that we haven't talked about. But if you understand the genotoxicity of cannabinoids and some of the things we've talked about, the paper on the dairy cows that we mentioned a moment ago showed that the official the official methods for measuring the levels of THC in agricultural products is incorrect by a factor of 7. It's underestimating it by a factor of 7, which would explain why the cows got stoned from eating so-called non-high hemp, which is supposed not to be high. So there are multiple ways that the food chain can be contaminated, but food chain contamination. And remember, because it's genotoxic and epigenotoxic, you're not just talking about the exposed population, you're talking about 4 or 5 generations to come. And these people, the population is not told, and they're not informed, and there's no consent given. So it's actually an inversion of the drug debate, and it has clearly very serious long-term implications for populations and for offspring and offspring's offspring for several generations. Thanks for listening.
Thanks very much, Stuart.